Hi, everybody. Thank you. Welcome to the Italian Embassy. I'm Andrea Sandre, Press and Public Affairs Officer here at the Embassy of Italy. I now give the floor to our Chargé d'Affaires, Gianluca Alberini.
Thank you. On behalf of our Ambassador Armando Verricchio, who is traveling, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Digital Diplomacy series. The focus today is on the digital economy, a topic that is of key importance to Italy. As you may know, Italy is the chair of the G7 throughout 2017, and the digital economy, as well as its declinations in terms of regulation, taxation, economic growth, entrepreneurship, and startups, have been included in the G7 agenda for this year. For example, the upcoming G7 Finance, that's to say the ministerial meeting of finance ministers that will take place in Bari on May 11th, 13th, will also address the tax challenges of the digital economy. To learn more about the Italian presidency of the G7, I invite you all to follow our new Twitter account at G7 in US, for our dispatches from the G7 summit, which this year will be hosted in the Sicilian town of Taormina, and the priorities of our presidency. You can also follow us on Medium at Italy in US, where we have a dedicated publication on the G7. The goal today is to better understand the present and the future of the digital economy, the challenges and opportunities ahead. We would also like to emphasize the aspects of innovation and economic and social impact, and how the private sector, government, and civil society can work together to fully empower the digital age. Without further ado, let me introduce Sonal Shah, who has graciously accepted our invitation to moderate this event today. Sonal is the Executive Director of the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. She's an economist and an entrepreneur with experience in both the private and public sectors. She's also the founder of the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation under the Obama administration. I'd like also to thank our panelists today. They represent tech groups in very diverse sectors, and I'm sure they'll offer ideas and developments on the status of the digital economy today. Grazie to everybody. So thank you again, Sonal. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, sir. I have to say the Italian embassy has done an incredible job at social media, getting the word out, because I think I received this invitation from at least 20 different people saying that they were coming today. So congratulations on your use of social media. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Just a quick scan of the audience. How many of you work in the executive branch of government? How many in the legislative? How many are in tech companies? Nonprofits? Other, which I didn't cover. Well, it's great to have you all here, and what a great conversation to be a part of. And congratulations to also the government for hosting this conversation on digital, especially at a time when digital is moving so quickly. It's really fascinating to watch the conversations taking place in Europe, and it's also been great to see your leadership and part of this conversation. So thank you, sir. We are, as many of you know, moving very quickly towards a digital economy, digital engagement. Everything is moving at a faster pace than we expect. Just as when you think something is just coming to terms, it's changing already. And I know the companies feel this on a fairly regular basis. Everything's changing, and then nothing feels like it's changing, right, when you're in government? I worked in government, so I say that. But I think, there are many positives, and there are also some ugly sides that show up with the digital economy, right? On the positive sides, very much we have an opportunity to create much more transparency. We have an opportunity to create much more agency. We have opportunity to create more information. Customers, citizens have more access to information, and you can become entrepreneurs in many different ways. It's not the traditional way. There are many other ways to become entrepreneurs. But also creates new challenges. So how do governments operate? How do companies and governments work more effectively together? How do companies, governments, and nonprofits work together? These roles are starting to change, and they're starting to evolve. And this is an opportunity to think about how that evolution gets created. Not so much in terms of what are all the negatives that can come out of it, but what are the things that we need to prepare for as we move forward? Because it isn't that we're going to go backwards. We are going to move towards a digital economy. The question is, how do we create the structures that allow us to do it more effectively and in a way that's more inclusive? So with that, we have an incredible panel here, and 4 amazing people who are doing amazing things at some of the leading companies in around the world, actually, not even just in the United States. So let me start here with Laurent Crenshaw. Laurent Crenshaw, my fault. Director of Public Policy at Yelp, and has an incredible background. We were just talking outside, but he's worked on the Hill, and then the last 3.5 years he's been with Yelp. Rachelle Celebrezze. Yes. I didn't do a good job practicing before I came. Senior Policy Advisor at Lyft, and how many of you use Lyft? Right? And amazing what it's doing for the transportation industry, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Margaret Richardson, she is the Director of Public Policy at Airbnb, also has had a variety of experiences from working on the Hill to a law firm at the Justice Department and now at Airbnb. So you bring a lot of different experiences to the table, which is fantastic. And Elias, the Senior Manager for Public Policy at eBay. And I have to say, eBay has got probably the biggest entrepreneurship background of all the people that come out of eBay are starting more interesting things than the thing they came from, which is amazing. So you have a good line of people to follow. So with that, let me just start. I'm gonna ask questions for about 30 minutes, and I hope all of you get ready to ask questions for the last 30 minutes, because this will become a much more interesting conversation if you all participate in it. And to my colleagues up with me, and say, if you hear something that you want to comment on, please feel free to step in. Do not wait for me to navigate this conversation, because I'd love for this to continue as a conversation. With that, let me start with you, Laurent. Yelp has made it easier for all of us to have a lot more information about where we're going, what we're buying, where we're eating, and it's from foods to cars to shopping. What are some of the lessons that you have learned from government, and what you have learned from Yelp and from government, and that you think are really important for us to think about?
Sure. In regards to the lessons learned from government, I'll say one of the things that government actually does a really good job of is generating data. There's a survey that needs to be done, a study, some sort of a question. There's likely a bureau, a department, or some division that is able to put resources towards accumulating information there. Now, on the other side, though, what government does a horrible job of, generally speaking, is making that data accessible and making it usable either for citizens, consumers, or the general public at large. And so one of the major projects that Yelp has worked on for a while that's actually intersected within the government space has been, it's a program that we call LIVES for short, but LIVES stands for Local Inspector Value Entry Specification. And it's an open data standard that we developed in conjunction with the City of San Francisco and Code for America for health departments to output their basically restaurant health scores, or just health scores for businesses in general, in a machine readable format that we then as Yelp can immediately pull in and display on the page, and for that county or for that city, that information. So you can not just, you can go there and find out, if they've got a good, fettuccine or whatever it is, since we're at the Italian embassy, but you can also find out if it's actually, sanitary. You can see that number attached to it. Now, that program that I mentioned is currently, it's available in around 16 counties and the state of Florida. We figured out a way to do it there. So it's not something that we've been able to nationalized yet, in part because we have to get the cooperation of the local or state governments to actually provide the data in that machine readable and open standard. And there are a number of different areas out there as well where we as Yelp, while our main platform is it uses user-generated content. You come to Yelp because you know that other people have likely already been to a place or have used a service, and you can see an aggregate of that overall experience so that you go into likely making a purchase or going to a destination with more perfect information. You make a better, more informed decision because you went to Yelp than if you just randomly tried to go somewhere. For example, even the Italian embassy, here, it has 4 stars with 10 reviews. I hear that the cafeteria here is fantastic and that the guards were smartly dressed. I can tell you the guards were smartly dressed. I saw them outside, very nice. And hopefully I, at some point, can try the food. I hear it changes on a daily basis. And if I had a embassy card or a State Department ID, that I could come here and eat. So those are things that I would not have known just on my own, maybe if I'd come here and asked the proper questions, but I went to Yelp and was able to learn about that prior to coming here. And so I think what's really cool about all the folks that are up here, because it's thinking about the digital economy and how we're all like intermediaries, and intermediary in the internet sense is kind of like making it easier for someone, for person A to interact with like business or other person over here. And from Yelp's standpoint, it's really about making that information accessible and usable for the individual and encapsulating in that sense. And that's what really, I think that like, I wish that, on one end, I wish the government did a much better job of that, of again, making the information that they had usable and accessible. But on the other hand, I also think that they should just make it more readily available so sites like Yelp and others can just utilize and display that information in a better, more user-friendly way, because at the end of the day, that's generally where people are going to go.
Laurent, what's the limitation on making that data available?
Honestly, there are certain things that passed at the federal level here in the US that have been very helpful. For example, the Data Act, which passed a couple of years ago, which has started to specify and say that there should be more open and machine readable standards for information that's put out there. But a lot of time, given the constraints that agencies already sort of have, it's difficult unless there's some sort of specification that's put out there for them to decide on a set standard. And as a company, that while we want to display useful information as much as possible on a particular page, we're resource constrained still. And so if we're trying to go through 50 or 100 different standards and incorporating all of that in there, it becomes a challenge after a certain period of time. So really more uniformity in how you display the information would be incredibly helpful for us so that we can just pull it all in there. Tech companies, we do a pretty good job of this, generally speaking, because we all have APIs, or most of us do, that we make available for other websites independent of our own to just link to us. They basically pull the API and they're able to utilize bits and snippets of our own platforms, because at the end of the day, we are, by giving them access to it and allowing them to utilize our product on their platform, it's generating more growth and more usability in general. And sometimes they come up with a new idea that we hadn't even thought about, and suddenly, the light bulb goes off and we're like, man, that's a great idea. We need to incorporate that into our own platform. And so I guess I'm saying that government should put out more APIs as well.
So one recommendation is standardized data and the other is APIs.
Yes.
Awesome. Rachelle, Lyft, well, I have to say you've kind of changed the way we think about transportation. And interestingly, I think also just thinking about assets being used in a very different way, your car. And it has changed the way we all get around the city now and not have to wait at some random corner trying to flag down a taxi. But transportation itself is changing. How have you all thought in the way you have disrupted the transportation industry, and what do you think the potential for companies like Lyft to work with government on thinking about new ways of approaching transportation?
Great, thanks. Can you all hear me, by the way? I'm kind of short and this is a little far away. That's a great question. And, at Lyft, exactly what you were talking about, the whole reason that Lyft was born and created in 2012 was to allow people to take an unused asset, which your cars sit in your driveway unused or in a parking lot about 96% of the time. So this asset is only used about 4% of the time. One of our co-founders, John Zimmer, went to hospitality school. And so he really took this approach when he came to the company and said, if this were a hotel and you had 4% occupancy in your hotel, you would be a failing hotel. So how can we take this asset that so many people have and you allow people to become their own entrepreneurs, to work on their own schedules, and to help out their neighbors and really create the sense of community to connect people in a way that we hadn't before. And I think, to answer your question about how we as the transportation industry, or this new disruptive transportation industry, can work with government and take advantage of this, I'll just give you a great statistic from our recent economic impact report. About 28% of our rides begin in a neighborhood that is a low-income neighborhood. And this is important because those are the neighborhoods that generally don't have good access to public transportation. The other thing I'll say is that about 50% of all Americans don't have good access to public transit. So this is a niche that we're working actively with governments to fill. We have several public-private partnerships with localities like Centennial, Colorado, San Clemente, California, Pinellas County, Florida, and we're actively looking for more and more to provide those first mile, last mile rides to help people get from their neighborhoods to public transit, to be a complement and to provide those services. Another way that we're working with governmental agencies and nonprofits is that we've partnered with several senior living associations, paratransit organizations, helping people who have mobility issues get to doctor's appointments, or people who may live, again, in areas where it's difficult to get to that public transit. So from everything from WMATA and the local shutdown, for those of you who live here, I have not gone unscathed. I usually take Metro to work, but there are days where I take Lyft to a Metro station that is more convenient, and then I finish my ride on Metro. So these are really the ways that we're looking at partnering, not just with government, but with nonprofits and with community members themselves.
And can you you gave us a little bit of the highlight of how you partner with some of these governments, would you mind just digging into one of them, say like Centennial, like what you're doing with that government and how does that partnership work?
Sure. So Centennial, they had a grant, and so they actually paid for the first mile, last mile rides to promote people in Centennial. They're a suburb of Denver. And so instead of having people drive their cars on their own or maybe with one other person downtown parking their car for the day, they entered into a partnership with us, and we provided the rides to anyone who called within a certain radius. And our engineering team worked that up. Can't tell you exactly how that works. It was very successful. People increased their ridership greatly. That's
great. Margaret, talk about another industry that is disrupting, Airbnb. How many of you used Airbnb? Right? We have good market in here, I'm telling you. You, much like what Lyft has done, you have also disrupted the hotel industry. Another sitting asset, which is your home, can be used by those visiting in town and not having to stay in a hotel, which creates a whole series of challenges, I'm sure, but also opportunities, frankly. And what have you learned about your host community and the larger community in which they operate? And then second question I would add to that is, how do you work with governments as you scale, similar to the Lyft model?
Sure.
Conversation.
Sure. So as Rachelle was speaking, I was thinking, oh, she's just saying all the things I'm about to say. So I'm gonna have to think about a way to say it differently. But a lot of the phenomenon is the same, where your home is an unused asset in many ways, especially if you're not there, if you're away, or if you have extra rooms. We have seen empty nesters. Our fastest growing population of hosts is women over 60. And that ends up being a great economic opportunity, but also a social connection that otherwise is not available. We've also seen that our fastest growth in cities is places that are not served by existing hotel or hospitality opportunities. So Southeast Washington and east of the river, for example, there aren't hotels available. And for people who want to visit family or friends or just stay in that part of the city, it's a much more convenient opportunity to do so. So those are the kinds of observations we're seeing all over the world. And our as the second part of your question, in working with governments, one of the things that we've learned is that our host community wants to comply with the laws. They want to have clear rules, and they want to understand what they're allowed to do. They also want to be able to contribute. And so as we think about our community, we have entered into voluntary collection agreements for taxes with over 200 jurisdictions around the world, and we're continuing to actively negotiate. It may be, come as a surprise to some, but you actually have to be permitted to collect certain taxes if you're not the traditional type of business. So for example, in the tourist tax, you have to be authorized to do so. So in a number of places, we've been able to reach agreements with cities to collect and remit tourist taxes. And in those places, that's a new source of income for the jurisdictions. And everyone who works in government, that was a big group that raised their hands, knows that you're always looking for new sources of revenue, especially as budgets are pinched. And that has enabled us to be very collaborative and to help cities, especially, but in some places, especially internationally, these are competencies that are handled at a more regional or sometimes even at a national level, and being able to help governments prioritize and to fulfill their priorities where they otherwise might not be able to with this additional revenue is one of the ways that we've found working with governments to be very effective.
And how quickly are people registering to be Airbnb hosts?
So I should have that statistic at my fingertips, but we've seen exponential growth year over year. I think at the end of 2016, we hit 80 million nights. So wow. We've had, at any point, we can have up to 1 million listings active. And so and we're also in 190 countries around the world. So most places that you would visit, you could stay in an Airbnb. And it's, the advantage of a platform where you can upload your information, be able to describe your neighborhood and your home in a way that is authentic, that is unlike anyone else's, is very attractive to travelers, particularly who are looking for unique experiences. We've seen that that's a big draw for our guests, is the unique experiences that they're able to have on Airbnb that aren't available anywhere else.
Yeah. So Alan, eBay, I would say, might be one of the founders of the micro entrepreneur industry many years ago, and I think the market has only grown from what I can gather, at least online. And I think it's created kind of a different type of trading system, right? Who can ship to whom. What used to be such border trade, now it seems to be a very global operation, and how it operates. So how has eBay's model created more inclusive marketplace? And what are the policy issues your entrepreneurs are facing?
Sure. I think to start, I wanted to speak briefly on kind of the traditional model of trades. Yeah. I think it's important to differentiate the two. And when we think of like the traditional model, we're thinking of really a handful or a smaller amount of very large companies that are exporting high volumes of goods. This is your container ship trade, your port trade, just kind of what people think of as the general kind of model of how goods move around the world. And for a micro or small business to participate in this system, they generally do so through global value chains. So that's when they partner with a large company as a supplier generally, and their part is taken into to the larger companies, kind of whatever they're making, and then shipped around the world. This new model, which we call the Global Empowerment Network, really comprises 4 things in terms of, you have to have access to the internet at low cost without gatekeepers. You have to have access to platforms, e-commerce platforms, access to payment services, so digital payments, and then access to kind of logistics platforms. So whether it's the United States Postal Service or the express carriers. And we found that when a smaller micro business has access to these things through the eBay platform, they are exporting at astronomical rates. I mean, revolutionary, historical. There's a lot of words that I can use, but some of our data, and this is data for what we call commercial sellers. So it's $10,000 or more in sales on an annual basis. So really, the micro business and up. We found that about roughly 95 to 96% of them are exporting. And this is globally on the platform. In the United States, I think it's 97%. In Italy, it's 92%. So almost all of them are exporting. When you look at traditional businesses, traditional brick and mortar, that number is really in the single digits. In the United States, it's about 1.5%. You know, in other countries, again, it's 5% or so, 6%, some break double digits. But, you know, again, it's 96% through the platform, through the Global Empowerment Network, and then you're talking about single digits otherwise. And then when you also look at things like the number of destination markets, you know, on eBay, you're seeing our commercial sellers are reaching 20, 30, 40 different destination markets. Some in Asia go up as high as 60 different destination markets. So it's not just selling to your kind of landlocked neighbor next door. I mean, these are really tremendous reach. And then we also do a stat, the percentage of sellers that reach 4 or more continents. And that goes from 30, 40, 50%, some places 90%. So we're really talking about global trade, you know, package-based, or I'm sorry, platform-based, you know, packages, global trade from the smallest of sellers. And it's very much balanced. And this is when you talk about inclusive global commerce. We did a report that we released in January of last year. We looked at 9 advanced economies and 9 developing economies. And we found the exporting levels were the same pretty much throughout. You know, they were all topping 90%. And it was the same with number of destination markets. It was the same with the percentage that reached 4 or more continents. And in some instances, in fact, many instances, the emerging market small businesses were outperforming the advanced economy small businesses. And we also see it from a rural to an urban basis as well. So it's really no matter where you're located. You know, this global empowerment network, this network of platforms is really enabling and empowering these micro and small businesses to reach customers directly all over the world. And again, it's inclusive commerce. I mean, it's inclusive global commerce. It's bringing everybody onto the platform to get the gains. And then also we found that, you know, the growth rates of these companies were outpacing the growth rates of their local economies. And so that benefits the local economies. They're growing, the local economy is growing, so everybody benefits from it. And, you know, we're really providing opportunities here for the smallest that never really existed.
And what are the trade issues that your micro entrepreneurs are facing? Are there export issues or not really?
You know, really, there are 2 things that when we, I think, work with governments that we like to raise. You know, it's the difference between the platform economy and the traditional economy is that small companies and micro businesses can now do what was really limited to large companies. And, you know, we think that, you know, the government policy, it really needs to be centered around getting access to these platforms, getting access to the internet, because that's where it all begins. And then really the other area is reducing friction at the borders. One of the things that, you know, we've realized over time is that, you know, the global trading system was designed around these large companies. It wasn't designed around a 2-person business operating out of their home, you know, who is getting on eBay, getting paid through PayPal, going down to their post office, shipping the package, you know, having it arrive, getting the feedback. And so we're dealing with a lot of, you know, you could think of it as legacy systems. You're dealing with a lot of, you know, friction at the border that was not really created for this trading system. And so it's things like the customs de minimis levels, you know, the threshold under which a package should come without having to pay duties, taxes at the border, things like that. Anything that's going to kind of gum up the works and, you know, make it harder or delay a package from a smaller micro business getting to their customer overseas. So that's kind of the message that we bring to global governments when we talk to them.
Yeah, these are not small issues. So I'm going to keep time here, but I'm going to ask you each one question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience a little bit. So I'm going to start with the 2 of you because y'all are similar industries, similar business models, but different areas that you're working in. Let me start with you, Rachelle, in the sense of when you think about how many people come onto the Lyft platform? How many drivers do you all have on average in cities, and how fast is this growing? And then what is it that is motivating drivers to want to be a part of Lyft?
So I'll answer the question. I mean, the number of drivers varies from day to day and city to city, but at the end of 2016, we were providing 16 million rides per month, and we're now in over 300 cities in the United States. That we were in 200 cities at the end of 2016. We had an aggressive push at the beginning of this year to expand to smaller places like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where we finally got some statewide legislation passed. So we're really trying to make this accessible to as many drivers and as many communities as possible. to answer your question about why I think, or why we think that people want to become drivers, it's complicated, but it's related to a lot of the issues that we were talking about earlier. It is people who have maybe concerns where a traditional 9 to 5 is not possible. Maybe they live in an area where it's difficult to get there. Maybe they have children. We hear from military spouses a lot that this is a great way for them to earn that extra income in order to take the family on a trip home. We have, I had one woman tell me she was driving to buy a Roomba. And so, I mean, people have their own individual reasons, but generally speaking, 80% of our drivers drive less than 20 hours per week. And so what that means to us and the drivers that I've talked to is that people have very specific monetary goals that they're trying to make, and they're trying to, make that little bit of extra cash for, like I said, a family vacation, or to put away for Christmas, or special gifts or things like that. And then I think that there are people who really, we have a retiree segment, much like Margaret was talking about. I've had several drivers say, I didn't know what to do with my time. I've got this really nice car that I bought in retirement, and now I want to drive it around, and this is a good way to pay for the gas and meet some new people.
Great question. My last Lyft driver, when I was going to the airport, said this was his way between his golf sessions. So he had retired from the government. Margaret, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. So what it raises, I think, amongst all of you a little bit is the 1099 economy, or in the United States, the independent workers economy. And what is that meaning from a perspective of where you all sit? And I could ask any one of you this question. What are the issues that get raised on that in terms of not just the taxes, but getting access to services, getting access to retirement benefits and other things? Like, what are those questions that are coming up?
Sure, and I think in some ways we're a little bit differently situated because of the home, and, but we do have, some of those same issues, and we're very interested in participating in the sector-wide conversations around these issues. We've talked with some of our colleagues in other companies that are similarly situated about portable benefits and the challenges for this is sort of the emerging economy in general. I do think that the reasons that people come to Airbnb, both as hosts and as guests, is some of the same issues that Rachelle was talking about. But in terms for our hosts, it can be to make ends meet. On average, we have American hosts make on average $6,000 a year, which is a huge gap to make up as real wages have sort of stagnated over the last several years. And our company was founded in 2008 by three guys who couldn't pay their rent, and they invited people to stay who couldn't find a hotel when they were wanting to come to town for a design conference. So the interests converged, and then a great idea was born. And so those kinds of synergies are the reasons that people come. And then the thinking about how we as a platform participate in these really digital economy wide conversations. I think there will be slightly different perspectives and issues for participants in each of the different platforms. But the question of what we're going to do down the road as a country or as an international community, thinking about these platforms is a real one that we're sort of very excited to participate with as a sector.
Great. Well, more on that, but I think just as background for everyone, portable benefits being that if you're, it's mostly employer-based where you pay into your Social Security and into other benefits. And so if you are not in that, how do you pay in? And is there a different way of thinking about it if you're participating in the this is all shorthand, I know.
Right, no, yeah, sorry about that.
So Laurent, let me start with you on Yelp. This concept of user-generated data, right? I have a view, I have an opinion, I can put it in. There's also criticisms around it, right? Which is who's actually participating in that? Is it just the people that were unhappy with the restaurant and happy with it, or do you get anywhere in the middle? There is this question around kind of where is the user generation coming from, and are we managing to all of it, or are we just only getting the edges of it? And then the second is coming back a little bit to the government generated data, which I think there's a lot out there. Are there particular early places to start that would be, kind of easy wins that you would think about, that if that data were available, it could make Yelp even work better?
Sure.
For them?
In regards to the first part of your question, we deal with that all of the time in regards to the whole question of validity of reviews. Yelp started in 2004. And literally a couple of weeks after the platform started, our CEO said, he's like, we started seeing fake reviews pop up, like the owner of a business saying, this is the best place ever, 5 stars. And I then also going on and saying, that bed and breakfast down the road is really crap. I saw rodents there, don't go there. And so it was a problem that we confronted early on, and we innovated our way out of it for the most part. So Yelp is a platform that, so sometimes I'll take a little step back. Only 78% of the reviews, approximately, that are written and posted to Yelp actually end up on the main page. The other 22% go into a category that we call are not recommended reviews. Because for every review that a person writes and puts on the platform, there's actually a fairly sophisticated suite of software that goes on in the back end that determines whether or not we trust that review. If we think that, it's written by a real person who actually had a firsthand experience there. And it's not perfect, but at the same time, and the best way, I guess, to sort of equate it is that it's similar in certain ways to credit fraud detection software. That's about how I would describe it. Like our CEO started off at PayPal beforehand, so sort of in the similar eBay world before he founded Yelp, and so took some of the principles and concepts there and put them into the review category. And so for the 121 million reviews that we have on the platform, that software is run through and looked at them to at least determine to the best of its ability if we can trust that review. Because there are instances where we have, and this has happened a lot over the last couple of years, where people have started taking to Yelp for protest purposes or political purposes. For example, last year during the election here in Washington, Comet Pizza ended up with thousands of reviews on its page dealing with all of the controversy that was surrounding it. And in rare instances like that, where we know that there's an active campaign to kind of game the system going on, that's when we have our human eyeballs come in. There's still a role for the humans here. And that's when basically we will post a warning on the page saying that that there's been a lot of strange activity going on and that we're actively engaged in cleaning up that page. So just take the reviews that are there with a grain of salt as this process goes on. And so we then will do that until we see we've removed what we believe to be the fake reviews and then or moved them to the not recommended page. And then we'll take that down once we see sort of a return to the normal with the software. And so because Yelp and a lot of platforms have had to deal with this if in the UGC space. Amazon's another good example for product listings as well, where there were a lot of companies that were out there trying to game the system, and they implemented new procedures and software as well to try to deal with that. And what we ultimately, I think you can take that, and apply it to other sectors and other areas as well. And I think that really it's about the more that you kind of do that, and you can then start to get a better aggregate, I guess, out of that. Because at the end of the day, like, to move into the second part of your question, what Yelp and other companies do really well versus government is that we're generating so much data at such a faster rate. Like, government data typically is very thoughtful and thorough because there's a set of specific criteria that they're normally looking at. And it can get very nuanced and granular, but it typically takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. That's why, the census only happens every 10 years or every decade or so, whereas we've been able to automate so much of it that we're able to create this picture very quickly. And now that we're putting in the pieces to also ensure that at least within a satisfactory area that we trust the data, it allows us to create a very a constantly changing picture. Like I would say, for example, like Yelp data over the last decade, compared to maybe like the Commerce Department's data or on business openings and closings within census, ours is right up there as being just as good as knowing where businesses are opening, where businesses are closing, where if you're a hairdresser, where you should probably open up a business if you had our data and were able to see where there's a deficiency in a particular area. And generally speaking, I think from a domestic standpoint, we'd love to have access to much more of the Commerce Department's data, whether it's census, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's a lot of even, NOAA. Wouldn't it be nice if for weather and everything else, since we deal with a lot of, vacation spaces and areas as well. So all of that. Basically, we just want it to be available like a fire hose, but Commerce would be a great place to start for that.
Oh, we need to convince government to keep that data coming.
Absolutely.
That's one of the bigger, I think, policy questions to keep in mind, just making sure that the source of data is a trusted source on a fairly regular basis. Alan, your comment about just the micro entrepreneurs, in economics, which is where I come from in the economics field, those were the people that were not seen a lot of times. It was the economy that was not seen, where lots of business was happening, and you're finally putting it onto a platform where micro entrepreneurs are now part of the working economy, or certainly not the underground economy, but very much on the over the ground economy. How do you think about, there is this question of all of these questions that start coming up, right? You don't want to, once you start becoming an entrepreneur, you realize what the tax systems are, and as an individual, you figure this out. And so how do your entrepreneurs navigate this process, right? Because, and I'll give you an example, just to kind of preface this. In a place like India, if you are a micro entrepreneur, you have to pay a certain level of taxes. But once you go to a certain level that seems slightly over micro, the tax rate jumps from small to very large. And so many stay at a certain level because they don't want to grow their business. How do you help your entrepreneurs navigate that? Do you all participate in it? How do you think about that?
Well, I think a lot, all of our micro businesses, all the businesses on eBay are so unique.
Yeah.
And, and the sellers I've talked to, they all start just for their, they all have their own unique reason for starting their business and what they want to do. But I think one of the themes that runs through is they're very dedicated, and they find, I would call it the fulfillment of doing this and really enjoying what they do. And, I think a lot of that and that drive that they have, leads them to do a lot of their own research, leads them to, talk to a lot of other people on eBay. I think, we have eBay meetups that take place where, they share information. There's eBay radio, there's, an eBay podcast, that talks about, the marketplace, and it shares stories of how people got started and what they do. So I think it's really just, there's a lot of information out there, and I think they find really their own path to it. We have our government relations office, our small business ambassador network, and these are people who show interest in government, participate in government, and so we engage with them, we talk with them, and so sometimes we provide tools for them to be advocates, and so sometimes through those conversations they'll have questions, and through that activity that they'll find information. But I don't know if there's one direct path. I think a lot of them kind of just use the different resources that are out there. They use the internet.
Yep. Question. So as you stand up, please give us your name, and please give a question. Please don't go on too long with statements, but we have 2 mics in the back, and if you raise your hand, we will get the mics to you. So we've got one here, and then we'll move over here. So can we start here?
Hi, I'm Sonal. I have a question for Lyft, actually. Sorry, Rachelle, sorry. I'm doing my master's in strategic public relations. So since you talked about lots of social, like corporate social responsibility that you're doing, I wasn't aware of any of those things. And I usually prefer Uber over Lyft because they're a little bit cheaper. And if I knew about all these things that you're doing, I wouldn't mind taking Lyft more often. So my question is that what kind of media public relations stuff that you're doing to make that public for all your consumers and users to know about it? Because I think this is not that many people knew about all these things that you're doing. I'm from Florida, and yes, the transportation's really bad, and we would love to have Lyft or Uber that's expanded and that would help communities there. So I thought that was cool. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks. So, I mean, really right now, it's a lot of word of mouth. We are a startup, and you've heard of the other guy, and the other guy has more money than us. But it's exactly through communications like this. We did have our first national ad campaign this past year, and one of the things that I think really differentiates us, and that we've really been talking a lot about, and we have a whole ad campaign around, is that we do provide the option for in-app tipping, and it is an option and that you can do. But we've paid out over more than, I believe it's $150 million worth of tips since we started, and that's just going to keep going, and that's money that goes directly into the driver's pockets. So it's not just interfacing with governments and working with communities and trying to really create this change within communities and in the social sphere, but it's also with our driver communities as well. We're trying to provide a better experience for the drivers as well.
Right here.
I'm Mike Nelson. I work for Cloudflare, which is a web security firm, and I wanted to talk a little bit about security. Lee Rainey and the Pew Internet Research Team have done phone surveys for more than 10 years, asking people about their internet use. And they find that more than 20% of Americans will never do e-commerce. They're scared about identity theft. They're scared about their privacy. The number's probably even worse overseas. So I'm curious, at least for the three of you who collect credit card information, what are you doing to assure people that they don't have to be scared about e-commerce? And are you doing things differently here than you are overseas?
Do one of you want to start?
I'm happy to start. I mean, trust and safety is our absolute, the lifeblood of our company. If people, I mean, not only online, but also in reality, if people don't trust that the hosts that they're going to stay with or that the guests that they're inviting into their home are safe, then the business falls away. And so we, much, like how Yelp operates, we have reviews, and that is the way that we have seen people are able to trust each other is by looking at previous guest reviews or previous host reviews. That's also how they trust the credibility of their experience, what's pictured in the picture is likely to be what they do. As with all online platforms, we have had unfortunate incidents of fraud and are trying to be as responsive as quickly as possible, remedying it, making sure that people get refunds and addressing it, working with law enforcement to ensure that the bad actors are apprehended and that they're not able to operate, is all a part of what we do to make sure that people are, and that those stories, when something bad happens, that they're able to, stay a user and to have their experience, to stay a host, to stay a guest. But those are the kinds of business, the business critical experiences that will always be. And we know that those kinds of questions around trust and safety are major barriers between consideration and actual use. And so we are always looking for new ways to inspire that trust and to ensure that we are on the cutting edge of the safety and trust, both online and in the real world.
Alan, do you want to?
I was going to say, we have a robust compliance and robust privacy programs. We have our rating systems as well to build trust, and I think it's going to be very similar for all of us. That people use those systems, they rely on those systems. Those systems have worked, and it would just looking for ways to keep that going and communicate that to people.
And I think there's also, to a certain extent, certain companies make a philosophical decision at a certain point. Are you going to be an opt-in or an opt-out company in regards to the data that you possess for an individual? For example, Yelp, we're more of an opt-in kind of company. So if you wanted to set up a Yelp account, really all you need is your date of birth, an email address, and then the first name and first initial of your last name. And you could even just, do an anonymous, like a Jane or a John Doe kind of a situation. But then beyond that, we then ask you, do you want to put your, have your date of birth be accessible to the business owner, at least within a range? Do you want your gender to be accessible and your location? And then you can even extrapolate that to a certain extent to, credit card, more sensitive information that's there. And for us, we think that that's just from a company standpoint, and every company, again, is going to be different. we decided philosophically that we thought that our users would appreciate that, having that ability to opt in versus basically saying, we've got all of your data, we've got all of your information, and if you don't want it to be just stored forever in our cloud, then choose which parts you want to opt out of.
We had a question up here too. Right here.
Hi, I'm Chris Arroyo. I'm with a tech startup called Phone to Action out of Arlington. I think this topic is very relevant, digital diplomacy. I focus on digital advocacy, right? And, over the past few months, regardless of where you fall in the political spectrum, there's been interest in engaging in the civic process. Do you think the tech community as a whole should take a more active role in making their voices heard on policies that are impacting them on Capitol Hill? Thank you. And thank you all for coming, by the way.
Right, I'm not going to let all of you have to answer this. So, Rachelle, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think you all know that we as a company donated $1 million to the ACLU after the first immigration ban executive order was signed. That's something that, again, talking about our core values, it's something that's very important to the company as a whole, and not just our employees, but our driver community and what we talk about. I think that just basically speaks for itself, that it is something that obviously our founders and we as a company are very interested in and being part of. At the same time, just because we've been talking about working with government, we do actively want to work with all levels of government. We are not saying, we're only choosing to work with one political party or one side of government. We need to be inclusive and work with governments and work with all of the people that we serve and understand that we're working in many different communities that have different needs, and so that we need to address those things so that we can do those things while still being true to our company values and investing in the future and in what we believe in. So that answers your question.
Right here. We have lots of questions.
Hi, this question could be for any of you. You're all global companies, so just curious, what are some of the biggest challenges you face when you have operations in emerging economies, especially where there's conflict? Just curious, yeah.
Do you want to try?
Sure. So we are a global company. We have listings and hosts and in almost every country in the world, and that is, obviously there are challenges in that from a corporate perspective, making sure that information is available in all the different languages. So things that are, really just operational, making sure that the business works, that we're compliant with local obligations, that we have an understanding of how we need to operate, and because homes and a lot of the laws that govern us are handled either at the municipal level or at the regional level, making sure that we have an appreciation with our policy team, the global policy team, that we have people who understand the policy issues all over the world. And obviously when there is conflict or when there are issues of instability, it's necessary to have people who are sensitive to that, who can be responsive to hosts if there are issues that impact guest safety. So less political conflict, but when there have been earthquakes or forest fires or things, we have a tool that we call the disaster activation tool. So we basically ask hosts that are within a certain radius to open their homes for free. So people can then find a safe place to live, and then hotels or other places can be available to first responders who need to be there. This has also been activated in a number of incidents of terrorist attacks, and that has been, a very important thing for us. Both, I think Rachelle spoke about their driver community. For us, our hosts and our guest community take very seriously the obligations to each other and to our mission. And so those are some of the ways that we approach those kinds of challenges when they occur. And as a team, we're operating in global time zones. So you'll get calls in the middle of the night sometimes, just that we need to act, and people are quite committed to doing so where we can make a difference.
Great. Right here.
Mike Macetic, since we're in the embassy of an EU member state, and it's generally regarded that the EU is a heavier regulatory state, heavier into legacy interests, both on the corporate and union side, could you all discuss some of the issues that have been Europe specific?
Sure, thank you. Alan, do you want to start?
Actually, I'm not really able to go into this,
Okay.
just because I don't have the knowledge base to, not because I don't want to. I work on the Americas side, so.
Laurent, do you want?
Yeah.
Sure. So we have been, we're in a lot of European countries, and we've actually worked with the European Commission in particular on competition policy issues. I like to say, to a certain extent, the internet used to be like the Wild Wild West, and now it's sort of like the West in the sense of you kind of have your railroad barons or the equivalent coming in a little bit. So, and we, have had certain issues in the past with Google in particular in regards to the competition space. And so we've worked with Commissioner Vestager and others over there really as they have looked into that issue. And I'm not going to go too far down the line there, but I would say competition policy in general. And then we've also, we also deal with a lot of like labor and workforce issues over there, as well as we have an office in Hamburg, for example, where we normally have like a large engineering team that's there. And we also have had offices in Dublin and London. And then really beyond that, we've also interacted some on the issues related to the digital single market. In the past, worked some on Privacy Shield as well, especially during the last administration. And so those are areas that we've been engaged, and European philosophy has been relatively different in the past in regards to internet and internet policy and growth. And I think that, one of the reasons it's so exciting that we're even having this conversation today is that hopefully under Italy's leadership and stewardship here, we'll continue to, Europe will continue to move forward in a fashion that eventually allows for more innovation and startup growth over there that matches what we've seen here in the US.
Rachelle, do you want to?
We're actually not in Europe we're not outside the US yet.
Okay,
Yet.
excellent. Back there.
I'm Carlo Rossotto from World Bank, and it's a follow-up question on developing countries and emerging markets. So from the perspective of government and policy changes, if you had to list the top two policy changes that would help your business or help the digital economy in developing countries, which ones would you identify?
Do you want to start?
I'll start. I think the main one for us is, when we talked about earlier, the customs de minimis levels, raising those levels, kind of across the board. The United States raised theirs from $200 to $800. Most of these levels are pretty low, and by raising them, this really allows sellers in developing countries to get their goods into other markets. And so that's something that we've been advocating for. I think that applies too to the Europe question earlier as well. Just being able to raise these limits, especially when it comes to things like cross-border returns. So just people who are exporting and then they have to, when their good comes back, now they have to deal with the de minimis again in their country. So that's really an issue that we've been working on a lot.
Margaret?
So I would say, both the authorizing, so making clear to hosts that this is permitted, or, so short-term rental rules, as well as working with governments on taxation issues, because the way it works under, we sort of understand that we're a new thing and that requires new rules. And so, we have actually worked some with some of your colleagues in the World Bank and using tourism as a development tool, and identified some markets where there's a long history and tradition of homestay and of working, of inviting guests into your home, or sort of micro entrepreneurship in that fashion, but that now, for the first time, they have access to a global marketplace of guests who otherwise might not know that they have phenomenal places to stay in these markets. And so thinking about how we can be a tool of democratizing travel, democratizing capital, and making sure that this platform really does bring people together all over the world. Rachelle?
Even though we're not in a global yet, I would say that what we've seen in the United States and working with the local markets, I think applies abroad, is that we really want to work with the local governments to get regulatory certainty and to really have new sets of regulations for our industry, just like what Margaret was saying, that it's a very different kind of operation. It's not your traditional taxi. It is peer-to-peer ride sharing. Someone is in your car and and you're able to track your ride and pay electronically, and it's all of these great things. And so you can't really put us in the taxi box that was sort of the beginnings of I guess the instincts in the very beginning. And so we've very successfully worked here in the United States with various levels of government in order to enact that framework. And so we mostly work on the state level, and we work with state legislatures to get that framework to allow for people to, in all of Texas, let's say, if you start in Austin and you end a ride in San Antonio, you can do that if you want to. And so having that regulatory certainty in other countries where it's really addressing our industry, I think would be great.
I'll actually hold off on that. It's a little bit different for us because Yelp is a platform. We're in over 30 countries, but we're not really in a ton of developing markets, because if you think about, generally people who use Yelp as a platform are they want to spend money, they want to go somewhere, they want to do something. And so it's a little bit more of a challenge to a certain extent to say, like if user base in a developing country or developing market is really going to engage on a platform like Yelp. Whereas, it would be great, obviously for tourism it works, but in sort of for the local sense, it doesn't quite.
How much time do we have really quickly? Okay, great. Question right here.
Hi, Christina Paulus, Real Clear Media Group. My question actually came from something that you said, Alan, about one of the routes to empowerment being access to internet. The FCC chairman today announced that they're starting the process to roll back net neutrality, Title II, of that. How does that affect your business? And this can be open for anyone. What actions are you taking on behalf of your clients, whether short-term or long-term, in regards to net neutrality and access to internet?
I'll just start. We support net neutrality, and we'll be advocating that position kind of through our government relations work.
Yeah, we've supported it in the past, and certainly I think we're all Internet Association member companies up here, and they've been taking a really active stance in the process right now. And obviously, internet access is a hugely important issue. It needs to remain. I think what's sort of interesting is like, from the perspective of our platforms, while we have a tremendous number of users on each of our platforms, from a data standpoint, we're not super data intensive. It's like the most that you'd really put on Yelp is maybe like a 30 or a 60-second video. And I'm going back into a little bit of the older conversation when, it was sort of like the whole item around data prioritization. But, I'm saying that, but at the same time, like, we all care about like having internet access for all. And I think that thankfully we've got a lot of great associations and larger groups and passionate folks that are out there who are going to be fighting for this issue. And that's at least how we're going to look at working on it going forward.
Question here.
Hi, I'm John Skidlaric, and my question is about privacy. So you collect a lot of information about your customers, where they like to go, how often they like to go there, where they stay, where they travel, what they sell. And there's been a lot of discussion about the digital economy, how the customer, if you will, becomes the product. So what are your company's policies about how you treat your customers' data, and what's fair game to sell or package or redistribute or market, and what's personal and private data that you're going to protect for the well-being of your clients? Thank you.
Margaret, do you want to start?
Sure. So we take privacy very seriously, and we, so in terms of thinking about it, we require law enforcement process in order to turn over interestingly, you're right, we do have a lot about where people travel, but as Laurent was saying, we don't have the volumes of data because the communications that we have is really, a heavy user of Airbnb logs on, several times a year, and not necessarily all day, every day. So the amount of information we have about where people are going on a day-to-day basis, it tends to be, as we move into business travel, it can be, maybe once a month, but it's not sort of on a daily basis. But that kind of information, we take very seriously the obligation to protect it. And so, this idea of commoditizing it and making it available to others is not something that we do or are interested in.
And I'll just echo that. I mean, that's exactly our perspective as well. It's the passengers' privacy and their data is very important. We're not interested in repackaging it and selling it. That's something that we guard very carefully and very diligently. We only give it up if we are compelled by, for law enforcement reasons. Obviously, there are compelling governmental reasons why that kind of data is required. But it does actually raise a different question in terms of interaction with government. If the government wants that data. And so there are privacy concerns on our passengers' end. Why does the government want to know where I'm getting picked up and where I'm going? And that is something that we fight very hard to protect. But at the end of the day, the government is often asking for that kind of data. And so having those kind of discussions and having passengers speak up for what they think is important or what kind of data that they want protected, I think is also important in this conversation.
Law enforcement or somebody else in the government?
So law enforcement is one particular issue. If someone files a complaint saying, something happened and we have to turn over data on a driver or a particular passenger, we will do that because they've gone down to the police station, they've provided us with the correct document, a court document, something like that. But I'm talking about laws. So New York City, for example, the Taxi and Limousine Commission actually recently wanted to pass a law saying that we as transportation network companies, and we're actually Black Car in New York City, and so is our competitor, that we all have to turn over this data, and that the purpose behind it, there's a government purpose, a government issue for it. But the question there is how, once it's turned over to the government, are there privacy protections from the government? Is that, could a reporter call up and say, I want all of your information for this borough, from these times and these days, and I want to know, and I'm going to publish this. So there are a lot of questions, not just on our end and what we're doing, but also, for the government to consider about when we're trying to share data. And we do want to work with the government. We think that it's important. There are a lot of ways that there's powerful information to be had there, but at the same time, how is that protected, and how do we work to continue to do that?
Right, question here.
This is a follow-up question. Kat Cummins from the Global Network Initiative. So we work with mainly data companies. But
I think they want to, here you go.
Oh, sorry. So we work with data companies like Facebook and Google and others. And of course, you guys are all data companies as well, right, increasingly. And you're also operating global markets. There's a very big difference between, on the one hand, a government asking for a request, either through a law enforcement or security agency, and if you actually give over that information. There's always a gray area, right? So my question is, because this is what we do, what systems do you have in place inside your companies to make sure that you're doing the right thing? Because some of these requests from government will be legitimate and legal, but some of them will not. And some of them will be about getting hold of information about dissidents or government critics, or it's going to be very problematic as you spread your marketplace around the world. And in fact, even in the case of democracies, there's many instances where governments request information and it may or may not be legal. So what systems do you have in place to handle that?
Do you want to try that, Margaret?
Well, so we have internal teams that are, obviously our legal team, but also policy teams in many of these countries that help set up the guardrails to make sure that as these requests come in, that they are valid legal requests, and that we also take, we have lots of consultations with groups like yours to make sure that we are thinking about these issues as they're evolving. And, we are not, as we evolve into different markets and as we get bigger and bigger, thinking about these things differently over time and making sure that we are learning from our colleagues who have been in the business longer. And obviously, we have a number of people who've been at other kinds of internet and technology companies who've had bad experiences with government with very dire consequences. And those kinds of experiences have informed us in setting up our policies to try to be quite thoughtful about those and to make sure that as we go forward and think about, as governments think about data localization obligations and questions like that, that we are thinking as a company about what are the things that we need to be aware of, where are the places that we need to help our community protect itself. And as you say, that there's, democracies are not immune from misuse of data. And so I think that these are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about to the extent that there are consortia of companies and advocacy groups that have best practices and are able to facilitate those kinds of conversations. We're quite interested in continuing to learn all over the world to make sure that, as these things shift, that we are keeping up with the best practices over time.
Do we have time for one more question? We're good. Okay, one more. All right, can we get one right here? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
My question is particularly to the gentleman from eBay. And let me start by stating that I do a lot of buying on eBay. I find it convenient, I find it easy, and the variety of products and the prices are competitive. However, in recent months, the last 2 months, the system completely failed me in the sense that there were some fraudulent listings. And even though I escalated the complaint and demanded some reasonable resolution, none was given to me, to the point where I'm quite disgusted with the whole thing. Needless to say, what can you advise that I do?
Why don't I talk with you afterwards and get your name, and I'll connect you with someone in a customer service department. I apologize if that happened, and we'll try to try to resolve it best we can.
Well, let me. Yeah, we have to cut off. Sorry about that. But let me just. I think this is just the beginning of a conversation. This is, as you see, a very hot topic, and every day you read the newspaper, there is something going on that either mentions any one of these companies or many of the other tech companies that are sitting in this room. And policy is going to change, or policy may not change fast enough, and maybe we should let the economy work itself out a little bit. There's always this tension that takes place, but the tensions, I think, for governments are not small. So, right, there are important questions that were raised here around privacy. There were important questions raised here about customer data. There are important questions raised about consumers and how consumers interact and what are ways that they can interact. But I think the bigger policy questions are also around big issues like the trade infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, the tax infrastructure, the data infrastructure, the way we think about giving data from government to the public. How can we make that data more publicly available? What does that need to look like? What are ways that we can make it available more effectively? How do we think about taxes, right? We're used to taxing in a certain way. And how do you think about taxing in a different way where it might reduce taxes in order to increase taxes over time? And what does that need to look like? So in many ways, the technology has certainly empowered all of us to get involved, but it's also changed the system by which we operate, which is largely based on legacy systems of large businesses. And now everybody can be a business and every person can participate, but in that is not the way our structures are set up. Certainly not the way our social security structures are set up. It's not the way our trade infrastructure is set up. It's not the way we operate. How many of you even think just locally? You think globally, don't you? You don't use eBay thinking, where do I buy from my neighbor? You think eBay, where is this available and how can I buy it? So we're moving from governments as borders to governments as negotiators to allow things to happen. And that is a change that's happening with policy. And so these are going to be active conversations, but what I would urge all of you to do is actively also participate in these conversations. Don't just watch what's happening, but also give your input where you can give input. Participate, whether it's through any conversations you can actively engage in, but understand what's also happening in your communities, but globally. Because it's an important conversation, but it's also an important conversation you should participate in, not just be a recipient of. And that is a lot of what will matter in this. So again, thank you to the Italian Embassy for really hosting us. Really, this is a fantastic conversation. our panel, who was fantastic. So really, thank you for taking some of these tough questions. So we look forward to talking to you more, and I look forward to coming to more of these events. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic. This is great.
That's some very tough questions.
Yeah, so you need to talk to your customer service.